The first thing you had to understand about the Verath was that they did not fight the way anything had ever fought before. Not faster in the way that a cheetah is faster than a man, or a bullet faster than an arrow, not faster in a way that exists on the same scale as the thing it surpasses. The Verath fighter class was faster the way light is faster than sound. It was faster in a way that broke the categories you needed to understand it. Human engineers had spent 3 years trying to build a targeting system that could track one. Not hit one, track one. Just keep it on a sensor screen long enough to establish a firing solution. They had failed every time. The problem was not the sensors. Humanity's sensor technology was, by any reasonable measure, excellent. The problem was that the Verath fighter's attack profile lasted between 2.8 and 3.4 seconds from the moment it crossed into weapons range to the moment it was gone, and a targeting computer, even a very good one, needed 1.1 seconds just to classify a contact as hostile. It needed another 0.6 seconds to establish track. Another 0.9 seconds to generate a firing solution. That was 2.6 seconds of computation before a single-point defense gun could rotate toward the threat. The Verath were gone in 3.1 seconds. The math was not close. What this meant in practice was that human warships could not fight back. They could absorb the first pass, and sometimes the second, and then they were dead. A Verath strike formation, typically 9 to 12 fighters, could mission kill a light cruiser in 2 passes and a heavy cruiser in 4. Colony ships, which had no armor and almost no point defense, died in 1. 8,000 people on the Arden. 1 pass. The Admiralty had understood the math for 2 years before they admitted it publicly. In the months before the admission, 3 different working groups had developed 3 different solutions. The first involved automated point defense grids so dense that a Verath pass would be flying through a geometric wall of shrapnel. This worked in simulation and failed in practice because the Verath changed their approach vectors in ways the grid planners had not predicted. The second involved mines, enormous quantities of them, seated in the approach lanes around protected assets. This worked until the Verath simply stopped using those lanes. The third solution was the one that worked, or at least the one they believed would work, because they had not yet tested it in combat. The third solution was the Reflex Program. The Reflex Program began from a different premise than the first 2. The first 2 had tried to answer the question, how do we make a machine fast enough? The Reflex Program asked instead, how fast can a human being actually be? The answer, it turned out, depended very much on which human being you were asking about, and what you were willing to do to them. Standard human reaction time, the time between a stimulus and a voluntary response, is approximately 0.25 seconds. Elite fighter pilots, tested under combat conditions, average about 0.19 seconds. The fastest human reflexes ever clinically measured, in a test subject who had been training specific neural pathways for 11 years, was 0.14 seconds. This was considered the biological limit. Neural conduction velocity, synapse firing times, the physical architecture of the human nervous system, all of these set a ceiling that training could approach but not break. The Reflex Program broke it. Not through training. Through modification. 12 years of research into the specific neurological features that had made the Verath such terrifying pilots in the first place, the thick myelin sheaths on their primary sensory neurons, the redundant motor pathways that allowed them to act on a decision while still forming it, the strange compressed time perception that their pilots reported experiencing during high-speed engagements, and then 12 years of attempting to replicate those features in human tissue. The results were mixed. Most modifications caused seizures. Several caused permanent cognitive damage. A few worked partially, in subjects who tolerated the procedures without major side effects. The best results of all, the result that had caused 3 separate oversight committees to classify the file and scrub the names from the public record, came from a subject who had not needed modifications at all. Lieutenant Kael did not need modifications because he was already half there. His mother had been a xenobiologist attached to the First Contact mission. His father had been, the file said, liaison officer, which was the kind of careful language that covered a great many complicated things. The relationship had been unexpected by everyone, including apparently his parents, and its result had been even more unexpected, a child who was, by every genetic analysis they ran, genuinely and approximately equally both. Kael had grown up knowing he was different before he knew what different meant. His eyes processed motion a quarter-second faster than any human eye. His hands moved before his conscious mind finished forming the instruction to move them. He could catch things that other children dropped. He could read a thrown ball's trajectory and position himself before the throw was released. His teachers had called it athletic intuition. His doctors had called it exceptional proprioception. The Reflex Program, when they finally found him at 19, had called it exactly what they needed. He was 26 now, and he had spent 7 years in a simulation that had been built specifically around his capabilities. The Reflex Program's training environment was calibrated to push its pilots to their absolute limits, to force them to operate at the edge of what their modified nervous systems could handle, to teach them to process and decide in windows of time that normal humans could not even perceive as discrete moments. For the other 11 pilots in the program, this meant operating in half-second windows. For Kael, the calibration ran tighter. He trained in windows of 0.08 seconds. What this felt like, from the inside, was not speed. Speed was a comparative term, and in the cockpit of a Reflex-class interceptor, moving at the velocities required to engage a Verath fighter, there was no comparison available. What it felt like was time stretching. The 0.08-second window in which he had to identify, classify, decide, and act did not feel like 0.08 seconds. It felt like a long and quiet moment in which there was room to think clearly, if you were willing to think in a very specific way. Not in words, not in sequential logic, but in something faster and more instinctive, something that lived below language. He had a word for this state. He called it the long moment. The program psychologists had a different name for it, tactical time dilation, which was accurate but ugly, and they had spent considerable effort trying to understand exactly what was happening in Kael's brain during these episodes. Their best theory was that his Verath neural architecture allowed him to experience subjective time at a ratio of roughly 30-to-1 during peak engagement, that a 3-second Verath attack run felt, to Kael, like approximately 90 seconds of subjective experience. He had never confirmed or denied this theory. He did not entirely trust words to describe what happened in the long moment, and he especially did not trust his own words, because he was aware that he was not a neutral observer of his own mind. What he knew was that he was the only pilot in the program who had ever successfully tracked a Verath fighter in simulation. What he also knew was that simulation was not combat, and that this distinction had a way of mattering. The briefing room on the CNS Halcyon smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee and the particular anxious sweat smell of people who had been awake for too long with bad news. Commander Verath ran the briefing the way she ran everything: fast, precise, without decoration. "Arden is 3 hours out from the Cressida Station approach corridor," she said. "Civilian colony ship, registration C-7741, carrying 8,214 passengers and crew. She's running under tug assist at 0.12 standard, no meaningful defensive armament, point defense system is rated for debris interdiction only." She tapped the display. 40 minutes ago, our long-range picket at the Meridian waypoint detected a Verath formation moving on an intercept vector. Formation count is confirmed at 11 fighters. Silence in the room. 11 fighters. 1 pass. 8,000 people. "Reflex wing deploys in 12 minutes, Verath said. 6 birds. Lieutenant Kael leads. Call signs Reflex 1 through 6. She looked at the 6 pilots seated at the table. Standard engagement doctrine does not apply here, because there is no standard engagement doctrine for this scenario. You will be making it up. What I can tell you is what we know and what we don't know. What they knew, the Verath formation was moving in a standard strike configuration, a loose V-shape with the point aimed at the Arden's projected position in 43 minutes. This formation was consistent with a single-pass colony ship kill, maximum saturation fire across the target's hull, no formation splitting, no feints, straight through and gone. 11 fighters, 1 pass, done. What they didn't know, whether the Verath knew the reflex wing was deploying. Whether they would adjust their formation if they detected it. Whether any of the 6 things that could go wrong with the Reflex Interceptor's experimental targeting systems would go wrong today, in combat, for the first time. "Lieutenant," Verath said, looking at Kael. "Questions?" He had one, and it was the only one that mattered. "What's the Arden's captain been told?" "To maintain course and speed and not to maneuver without our instruction." "And if we fail?" Verath held his gaze for a moment. "Then she maneuvers." Which meant, then she dies slower. "Understood," Kael said. He stood. The other 5 pilots, Rhea, Doss, Carta, Singh, and Ven, stood with him, and there was something in the way they moved, the particular economy of motion that the program had trained into all of them, that made them look less like a collection of individuals and more like a single organism with 6 bodies. They had trained together for 3 years. They knew each other's reaction profiles, their decision tendencies, their failure modes. They did not need to speak to communicate anything essential. In the corridor outside the briefing room, Carta fell into step beside Kael. She was the second best pilot in the wing. Her modifications had taken better than anyone else's except his, and she was also the only one who ever said what she was actually thinking. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "Don't," Kael said. "I keep thinking about the gap between simulation and Carta." She stopped. They walked in silence for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." He looked at her. He did not say it'll be fine, because she would know he was lying, and because lying to the people who were about to follow him into the only combat engagement the Reflex Program had ever run seemed like the wrong way to start. "Trust the long moment," he said instead. She nodded once, the precise nod of someone who was not entirely sure they believed something but had decided to act as though they did. 12 minutes later, 6 Reflex-class interceptors launched from the Halcyon's Bay in a single ripple sequence, 3 seconds apart, and turned toward the Arden. Space did not look the way people expected it to look from inside a Reflex interceptor. The cockpit canopy was heavily filtered, unfiltered space at combat velocities, with the visual processing load of a high-speed engagement, had caused 3 test pilots to experience perceptual overload bad enough to be classified as a medical emergency. What Kael saw through his canopy was therefore a processed interpretation of space. Threat contacts rendered in crisp amber, friendlies in blue, the Arden a steady white cross at his 11 o'clock low, 41,000 kilometers and closing. The Verath formation appeared on his scope at T-2 minutes 20. 11 contacts. V formation. Moving exactly as Vantera had predicted. Kael's thumb found the comm without looking. Reflex wing, I have 11 contacts, bearing 274 by -12. Formation is strike V, no deviation from predicted. We go on my mark. A pause. Watch your intervals. We're not in the sim. Copy 1. Carta's voice, flat and ready. Copy. Doss. 1. Rhea. Copy lead. Sing. Up. Then. The Verath did not appear to have adjusted their formation. Either they had not detected the reflex wing, or they had detected it and didn't care, which was a different kind of problem. Kael spent 1.4 seconds, a long time, in his economy, considering the second possibility and decided he could not plan for it without more information. He set it aside. T-140. He keyed the wing frequency. Formation spread to standard engagement intervals. We'll meet them at the V's leading edge. Pairs, I'm with Carta, Doss with Rhea, Singh with Ven. If you lose your pair contact, fall back to solo doctrine. Do not, repeat, do not, chase a Verath past your engagement window. 3 seconds, then you're done, next pass. No heroes. He had said this last part because it was doctrine. He had also said it because he was aware that doctrine, in 3-second engagement windows, had a way of dissolving. T-120. The Arden was still on course. 8,000 people in a white cross on his scope. He found himself thinking, briefly and uselessly, about what 8,000 people looked like in one place. He had been to a stadium once, as a child, and the crowd had seemed like more people than could possibly exist, and then he stopped thinking about it because there was no productive end to that thought. T-50. They see us, Carta said. A statement, not a question. On his scope, the lead elements of the Verath V were beginning to adjust. Not a formation change, just a slight sharpening of approach vector, the kind of minute correction that a targeting computer would classify as navigational variance, and a pilot with Kael's processing speed would classify as they're choosing their attack angle relative to our position. Confirmed, Kael said. They're threading the approach. They'll come through us on the way to the Arden. Weapons free on my. The Verath formation accelerated. This was, Kael registered in the first fraction of a second, not the acceleration profile the briefing had predicted. The predicted profile had the formation maintaining approach speed until T-5, then a final burst through the engagement zone. What he was seeing instead was the acceleration happening at T-40, which meant they would be through his wing's intercept window. He ran the geometry. It took him less than a second. 8 seconds early. "Mark," he called. "Engage now, full spread." And then the Verath were there. This was the thing about the long moment. It did not begin gradually. It arrived all at once, like a door opening into a different room, and the room on the other side had different physics. Not slower, but wider, as if the dimensions of each instant had been stretched to accommodate more of reality than an instant was supposed to hold. The first Verath fighter crossed his nose at a range of 400 meters and a closing speed of approximately 4,200 meters per second. At that closing speed, it crossed the full diameter of his effective weapons envelope in 0.19 seconds. He had 0.19 seconds to acquire, fire, and adjust, and within those 0.19 seconds, in the long moment, which made those 0.19 seconds into something he could actually inhabit, he did several things that, reviewed on recording afterward, appear to happen simultaneously. He pulled 4 degrees right and 2 degrees down, placing his nose inside the Verath's projected turn radius. He fired a 3-round burst from his forward cannon, leading the target by what his instincts rather than his instruments told him was the correct amount. He registered, in his peripheral scope, that Kael had engaged the second Verath in the lead element, and that her burst had missed, but her positioning was correct for a second shot that she would not have time for. He registered that Doss and Rhea were engaged on the right side of the formation, and that Doss's first shot had connected with something, possibly a wing section. He registered that Singh and Ven had not yet fired, which meant they were still acquiring. His burst connected. The Verath fighter at his nose did not explode. It came apart, which was different, a structural failure that scattered it across a volume of space rather than consuming it in a single flash, and the debris passed through his engagement zone in a cascade of amber fragments on his scope. 1. The long moment stretched further. He was already turning, because the first Verath was gone and the formation had 9 more and they were still accelerating, and the geometry of the next 4 seconds, which in the long moment was actually, subjectively, closer to several minutes, was a problem he was already solving. The Verath formation had split into 3 sub-elements in the first engagement pass, which was either a pre-planned response to detecting the reflex wing or a spontaneous tactical adjustment, and it didn't matter which because the operational consequences were the same. Instead of a single V driving straight at the Arden, he now had 3 separate attack vectors converging on the colony ship from 3 slightly different angles. "Formation split," he called, and his voice sounded strange to him, too slow, the words taking too long to leave his mouth. 3 elements. I count 4, 3, 4. Kael, stay with me on the left element. Doss, Rhea, center. Singh, Ven, right element. A beat. They're going for the Arden. We stop them here or we don't stop them. 3 seconds had passed since the first engagement. The second pass was already beginning. The second Verath came at him from above, from his upper left, specifically, crossing his cone of view in the 0.2-second window between when his canopy sensors picked it up and when it would be past him. He was already moving. The interceptor's controls were direct neural link, no intermediary interface, just thought translated to thrust, and the thought was already formed before he had consciously formulated it. Down and right, nose leading, 3 rounds. Down and right. 3 rounds. The burst went wide, and he knew it was going wide while the rounds were still traveling. His read on the Verath's turn was 1/10 of a degree off, a tiny error that at 4,200 meters per second closing speed was enough to miss by 30 meters, and he was already correcting, already pulling back into a position to re-engage on the next pass. But the next pass would be the third pass, and the Verath would be much closer to the Arden by then. On his scope, Rhea had gotten a hit on the center element. One of the 4 contacts there was showing a degraded movement signature, possibly damaged, possibly breaking off. Kael had fired twice on the left element and missed twice, but her maneuvering had pushed 2 of the 4 contacts in her sector into a less favorable attack angle. They would still reach the Arden, but their fire window on the colony ship's hull would be narrower. Singh had taken a hit. He registered this last fact and filed it precisely. Singh has taken a hit. Singh is still flying. Singh has not called anything. Singh, he said. Status. Up, Singh said. Minor. Left thruster degraded. I'm still in it. Ven, stay close to Singh. On it. For seconds since the engagement began. The left element, Kael's element, his responsibility, was 3 seconds from weapons range on the Arden. 3 seconds. He had run this specific geometry in simulation 412 times. He knew the number precisely because the simulation's debrief system logged each run and he had reviewed the logs, and the geometry he had run the most, more than any other engagement scenario in the entire training library, was this one: multiple Verath elements converging on a civilian asset from vectors that created firing overlaps, forcing the interceptor wing to prioritize and sequence their responses in real time, under the constraint that any element they failed to stop would reach the civilian asset and there would be no second chance. In simulation, his win rate on this geometry was 71%. He had thought about this number a great deal in the hours since the briefing. 71% was good. 71% was, according to the program statisticians, better than any other pilot in any simulation they had ever run. 71% meant that in 3 out of 10 engagements with this exact setup, the civilian asset was destroyed. He was not in a simulation. "Carter," he said. "Left element, lead contact. Take the shot." "I don't have a window." "Take the shot on my mark." The thing about Carter was that she trusted him. He did not know if this was warranted, but it was true, and right now he needed it to be true because what he was about to do required her to fire at a moment that would not feel to her like the correct moment. Mark. She fired. He was already pulling his interceptor into the burn that would, if the geometry he was running in his head was correct, and the geometry was running at the edge of his capacity, multiple moving elements, high closure velocities, degraded information on the damaged contact in the center element, place him at the right position to take the second shot on the lead contact of the left element, 0.3 seconds after Carter's round arrived. If Carter's shot caused even a minimal evasive adjustment in the lead contact, it would bring the contact slightly higher and to the right, and he would be waiting there. Carter's shot arrived. The contact adjusted. Higher and to the right. He was waiting there. He fired once. The contact dropped off his scope. He was already turning to the center element, and it was here, in the turning, in the 0.11 seconds between his solution on the left element and his reorientation to the center, that he lost something. He lost a contact. The center element had been showing 4 contacts when the engagement began. 4, then 3 after Rhea's hit, then, somewhere in the 0.4 seconds he had spent on the left element, 3, then 2, then. He ran his scope. 2 contacts, center element, approaching the Arden's projected position. But the center element had started with 4. Rhea's hit had degraded 1, possibly killed it. That left 3. He was looking at 2. He ran the scope again. Not a glitch. 2 contacts, center element. DOS and Rhea's positions, on his friendly display, were consistent with them having engaged the center element. 1 contact was not accounted for. He had 1.8 seconds before the 2 visible center element contacts reached weapons range on the Arden. He used 0.3 seconds to run the most important calculation of his life. If the missing contact was destroyed, if DOS or Rhea had gotten a kill that hadn't registered on his scope, then the problem was 2 contacts on the Arden and his wing could stop them. If the missing contact was not destroyed, if it had broken off from the center element and maneuvered, then it was somewhere he couldn't see, which meant he keyed the Arden's command frequency. "Arden, this is Reflex 1. What are you showing on your aft sensors?" A pause. Even in the long moment, the pause felt long. "Reflex 1, Arden actual, we have a contact. Aft quarter, bearing." The Arden's scope was less precise than his, the reading softer, the position less certain, but there was a contact behind the Arden, in the aft quarter, and it was the missing fighter, and it was already inside the point where the Arden's non-existent defenses could do anything about it, and it was inside the point where DOS or Rhea, who were committed to the 2 center contacts, could break off and reach it in time, and it was inside the point where Singh or Ven, who were still engaged with the right element, could reach it, and it was inside the point where he ran the geometry. He could reach it. If he broke off from the left element's remaining contacts right now, immediately, and burned at maximum thrust on a vector that he was already computing, a vector that would thread between the Arden's drive flare and the debris field from the contact he had just killed, he could reach the aft quarter in 2.1 seconds. That was the calculation. The other half of the calculation was what he would be leaving behind. The left element still had 2 active contacts. Carter was engaged with one of them. The other was unengaged, and without Kael on it, it would have a clear window to the Arden's forward section. 1 Verath fighter, 1 pass, 1 shot at the Arden's bridge. The Arden might survive that. A colony ship's bridge was not the most critical structural section. Might, depending on what the Verath was carrying, depending on the hit angle. He had 1.4 seconds left in his decision window. The third option, the option that the simulation had rewarded him for finding 12 months ago, in a run that his instructors had watched twice and then asked him to do again so they could watch it a third time, was not available here. In the simulation, the third option had involved a specific geometry where a fourth friendly interceptor could be vectored to cover his exit from the left element while he burned for the aft contact. He had run the geometry 3 times in the 0.6 seconds since he identified the problem. There was no fourth interceptor available. The wing was spread too thin. 2 options. Cover the left element's remaining unengaged contact and let the aft fighter make its pass on the Arden. Or break off and burn for the aft fighter and leave the forward section exposed. He had 0.9 seconds. In the long moment, 0.9 seconds was time enough to think. Not time enough to think well, or completely, or with any certainty. But time enough to reach a conclusion that was better than a guess. The aft fighter had been running silent, which was why he had lost track of it, which was why it had broken off from the center element without triggering his scope, and a fighter running silent was a fighter that was not actively accelerating into an attack profile. It was maneuvering. It was repositioning. Why would a Verath fighter reposition behind the Arden rather than making a direct attack pass? He spent 0.2 seconds on this question. Because it's targeting the drives. A hit on the Arden's drive section would not destroy the ship. But it would leave the ship dead in space, unable to maneuver, and the Verath formation, whatever remained of it after this engagement, could circle back at their leisure. It was a different kind of kill. A slower one. A forward hit on the bridge might destroy the ship in a single pass if the Verath was carrying the right ordnance. He had 0.7 seconds. The bridge kill was the faster risk. The drive kill was the longer one, but a dead ship with 8,000 people on it, drifting without power, with the Verath knowing exactly where it was. He was already moving. He keyed the wing frequency as he committed to the burn, because there was no time for discussion, but there was time for one sentence. Carter, the left element's second contact is yours. Alone. You can do this. A half-second pause that felt, in the long moment, like a held breath. Copy, Carter said. He burned. Maximum thrust in a reflex interceptor was a physical experience that no training completely prepared you for. The acceleration pressed him into his seat with a force that would have caused an unmodified human pilot to lose consciousness within seconds. He did not lose consciousness. His Verath biology handled it the way it handled all of the extreme demands the interceptor made, by simply continuing to function, which was a thing he had learned not to take for granted, because it was a feature that had been conferred on him by a set of circumstances he had not chosen, and the pilots beside him who had to survive the same accelerations through modification rather than inheritance were, he thought, more impressive for it. The Arden's hull came into his visual field at 2.1 seconds after the burn began, exactly as calculated. The Verath fighter was in the aft quarter, real and solid and amber on his scope, and it was moving into its firing position, and it had not yet seen him because he had burned in from an angle that kept the Arden's drive plume between him and the Verath's likely sensor cone. He had 0.3 seconds before the Verath reached its optimal firing point. He fired first. Not at the Verath. Not directly. He fired at the space where the Verath would be in 0.15 seconds, where the geometry of its approach told him it was going, where a pilot trying to thread a firing solution on a colony ship's drive section would have to be, and he fired 3 rounds into that space and then pulled hard to avoid the Arden's drive flare and waited for the light. The light came. He did not see the contact drop off his scope because he was in the middle of a hard evasive turn and his scope was momentarily saturated by the proximity to the drive output, but he felt the absence of the threat the way you can sometimes feel a sound stop, not the presence of silence, but the specific goneness of something that had been there. When his scope cleared, the contact was not on it. 3. He had 0.9 seconds of fuel remaining in his primary burn tanks. He spent 0.1 seconds being aware of this fact, and then he was already on the secondary tanks, already turning, already pulling the engagement picture back into focus. On his scope, 2 contacts remaining in the center element, still driving toward the Arden, and Doss and Rhea were with them, and Doss was firing, and 1 contact was adjusting, and then 1 contact. Center element. 1 contact, and it was past the Arden's effective intercept window for Doss and Rhea, and it was going to make its pass. "Arden," he said. "Brace. Forward starboard quarter. Now." He did not know if the warning would mean anything. He did not know what bracing could do for 8,000 people in the path of a Verath strike pass. But it was the only thing he had left to give them. The Verath fired. Later, much later, in the debrief that would last 6 hours, they would establish that the last surviving center element contact had been carrying a degraded loadout. Rhea had scored a partial hit earlier in the engagement that had compromised the contact's weapon systems. The shot it fired on the Arden's forward starboard quarter carried approximately 40% of its designed yield. The shot punched through the Arden's outer hull plating and vented 3 compartments to space. Of the 21 people in those compartments, 11 were in pressure suits and survived. 10 were not. 10 people against 8,214 who made it through. In the long moment, in the stretched and quiet interior of that strange time, where Kael was watching the Arden take the hit and watching the last center element contact burn past the colony ship and watching his scope for the right element, where Singh and Ven were still working, there was no calculation available that made 10 deaths feel small. The math was not the point. The point was that 10 people had been in those 3 compartments, and now they were not, and the fact that 20,000 times 10 more people were still alive did not reduce the 10 to 0. He held this and kept working. The right element broke. It was Singh who did it. Singh with his degraded left thruster, who had no business being as effective as he was in a ship running at 70% thrust capacity, but who had grown up flying in mountain wind corridors where you learned to compensate for asymmetric thrust before you learned anything else. He had been working the right element with Ven for the full length of the engagement, and at some point in the fighting that Kael had not been able to directly observe, something had changed in the Verath formation's behavior. They had hesitated. This was, Kael would think later, the strangest thing about the battle, stranger than the speed, stranger than the losses, stranger even than the long moment itself. The Verath had hesitated. 2 of the right element contacts, in the middle of their attack sequence, had slowed by a measurable fraction, had fractionally widened their formation spacing, had done the thing that a fighter pilot does when something in the tactical picture has surprised them and they are, for just a moment, reassessing. The reflex wing had surprised them. Singh had been waiting for exactly this. He had positioned himself for exactly this kind of fractional hesitation, not because he had predicted it, but because he had the kind of spatial patience that made him useful in exactly these situations, the ability to maintain a position that would be correct when a specific small thing happened, and then to be right there when it did. He fired twice in the hesitation window. 2 contacts gone from the scope. The last 2 right element contacts did not hesitate. They burned wide, not toward the Arden, but away from it, away from the engagement, the hard burn of fighters executing a tactical withdrawal, and Kael tracked them for 4 seconds to confirm the vector before he let them go. He let them go. On his scope, 4 contacts remaining of the original 11. 2 of them were in withdrawal. One was the degraded center contact that had made the pass on the Arden and was now burning away in a different direction. One was, his scope told him after a careful second look, not moving. A Verath fighter, stationary. Not dead, he could see faint thruster signatures, residual power, but stationary. Unable to maneuver. He spent a moment trying to decide what this meant. He decided it meant the battle was over. Reflex wing, he said. Report status. 2. Up. Carta. 3. Up, minor. DOS, the minor he didn't specify. 4. Up. Rhea. 5. Up. Singh. 6. Up. Ven. 6 voices. 6 ships. All of them still flying. He said, break off. Reform on my position. We're done. The Arden was still on his scope, still a white cross, larger now, close enough that he could resolve it on visual without magnification if he looked off the left side of the canopy. A colony ship was not a beautiful vessel. It was large and awkward and built purely for the function of keeping 8,000 people alive in the transit between one world and another, and it was an ugly functional thing with its drive section and its habitat rings and its unglamorous mass of cargo and life support and fuel, and Kael found it, in that moment, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He did not say this. There was no one to say it to, and it was the kind of thought that didn't survive being spoken. He flew beside the Arden for 40 seconds, watching it, and then he turned his interceptor back toward the Halcyon. The wing landed in recovery sequence. Ven first, then Singh, then Rhea and DOS together, then Carta, then Kael last, as was proper for the lead. The Halcyon's recovery bay was lit in the yellow of operational alert, not yet stood down, and as Kael's interceptor settled into its cradle and the magnetic locks engaged and the bay pressurized, he was aware of the sounds coming back. The bay sounds, mechanical and ordinary, the hiss of pressure equalization, the clunk of service umbilicals connecting, all of it exactly as it had always been, unchanged. He sat in the cockpit. The engagement was over. The Arden was intact. 6 pilots were alive who, by any statistical reckoning, might not have been. He had run the post-engagement numbers in the last 60 seconds of transit, an automatic habit, the program had trained it into him, and the numbers were, by the metrics he was supposed to care about, good. Formation broken. Civilian asset secured. Wing casualties 0. 10 dead on the Arden. He sat in the cockpit. The long moment was gone. It had left the way it always left, not gradually, not with any ceremony, just suddenly absent, the room with the different physics closed, and what replaced it was the normal speed of the world, which had always felt, after the long moment, slightly too slow to be real. Colors were slightly less sharp. The sounds in the bay arrived with a normal fraction of a second of delay between stimulus and perception, and this delay, which was undetectable to anyone who had not spent years in the stretched time of peak engagement, felt to Kael like a kind of lag in the world itself, as if reality were buffering. He knew this feeling. It went away in a few hours. It always had. He sat in the cockpit and did not move. He was aware, somewhere at the back of his attention, that the bay crew had cycled in and were working around his interceptor, and that the normal post-recovery protocols were proceeding, and that at some point the canopy would need to come up. He was aware of this. He was also not yet able to do anything about it. In the long moment, he had made 312 discrete decisions. He had counted this in the transit home. He had not intended to count, but the count had assembled itself anyway, the way certain things did when you were running at that level of processing. 312 decisions, each one in a window of time that normal human perception could not have perceived as containing a decision at all. Each one irrevocable. Each one with outcomes that had branched and ramified and landed where they had landed. 10 dead on the Arden. If he had made one of those decisions differently, the burn for the aft fighter, specifically, the moment where he had calculated and chosen and committed, leaving Carta alone on the left element, would the number be different? He ran it now, in the flat ordinary time of the recovery bay, without the long moment's clarity. He ran it and he got a different answer than he had gotten in the 0.9-second window. In the 0.9-second window, the calculation had been clean. The aft fighter was targeting the drives, a drive kill was survivable, burn now and stop it. Clean and clear and decided. In the flat ordinary time of the recovery bay, the calculation was murkier. The aft fighter might have been targeting the drives. It might have been targeting the hull. It might have been carrying a full-yield warhead rather than the degraded loadout of the center element contact that had gotten through. If it had been carrying a full-yield warhead and he had not gone for it, if he had stayed on the left element and left the aft fighter to make its run, then the calculation that had seemed clean was not clean at all. But he had gone for it. He had chosen correctly. He knew this. He sat in the cockpit and found that knowing you chose correctly was not the same as feeling at rest about the choosing. The canopy opened. He had not requested it. The bay crew had, after some interval he had not been tracking, executed the override that allowed them to open a canopy when the pilot was unresponsive, a protocol that existed for medical emergencies and for other situations that the protocol document described as pilot distress following engagement, which was a careful way of saying what it meant. Cool bay air came in. It smelled like hydraulic fluid and metal and the faint industrial sharpness of the recovery systems. It smelled like the bay always smelled. It smelled like before. There was a face at the edge of the canopy. Crew Chief Neka Adiz, who had been crewing for the Reflex wing since the program came aboard the Halcyon, who had seen all 6 pilots return from their first combat engagement and who had therefore seen the way each of them sat in their cockpit for a moment before they moved. She had a face that gave nothing unnecessary away, which was a quality Kael respected enormously. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Sir," she said, which was how she always started. He waited. She seemed to be deciding whether to say the thing she was going to say. She said it. "Are you all right?" It was such a plain question. "Are you all right?" He considered it with the same care he would have given anything worth considering. He was unhurt. He was functional. He would debrief and file his report and review the engagement records and be back in the rotation within 72 hours, because that was what the program required and because there was, by any reasonable accounting, more work ahead. The Verath formation was broken but not gone. The aft fighter he had killed was the third he had killed in his career, if you counted the 2 simulated kills that the program had, for record-keeping purposes, declined to count. The wing had performed well. The Arden was intact. He was all right. He knew this. He looked at Adiz and said, "How long was that?" She frowned slightly, the frown of someone accessing information from a secondary source rather than memory. She glanced at the recovery board on the bay wall, where the engagement clock was still visible, frozen at its final mark. 3 minutes, 40 seconds, she said. He heard this. He thought about the 312 decisions, and the long moment, and the left element and the aft fighter and the last surviving center contact making its pass, and the 10 people in 3 compartments, and the geometry of the burn that had threaded between the Arden's drive flare and the debris field from the contact he had already killed, and Carter's voice saying copy, and Singh in his degraded ship waiting with spatial patience for the fractional hesitation and the stretched interior time of an engagement that had contained, for him, the subjective experience of. He nodded slowly. "It felt like a week," he said. Adiz looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone receiving information that they will need time to process later, in private. Then she extended her hand to help him out of the cockpit, because that was the next step, and the next step was always available, regardless of what had just happened, and that was, Kael thought, either a comfort or just a fact, and sometimes those were the same thing. He took her hand. He climbed out of the cockpit. Outside, in the bay, the Halcyon hummed and breathed around him, enormous and ordinary, and somewhere in the distance of its corridors the other 5 pilots of the Reflex wing were climbing out of their own ships, and somewhere 3 hours behind them the Arden was still moving, still carrying its 8,000 people toward Cressida, and somewhere further back, in the expanding debris field of the engagement zone, the evidence of 3 minutes and 40 seconds lay scattered across a volume of space that the retrieval teams would map and document and file, and none of it, not the filing, not the documentation, not the mapping, would convey the thing that Kael already knew it was not possible to convey. That the 3 minutes and 40 seconds had been, from the inside, a very long time. That in a very long time, a great many things happen. That you carry all of them with you when you climb out of the cockpit. That you carry them at ordinary speed, and they weigh what they weigh.